Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes.
So we got finally to the final lecture of this course after several lectures. So I remind you that we've seen well, the foundations of geometric deep learning, geometric priors, and then different domains, whether it's graphs, grids, and groups and manifolds, gauges. And then Petar actually didn't talk about sequences and time. He talked about categories. So today I would like to talk about some of the applications, particularly for graph neural networks, and then maybe some directions that at least I personally believe to be interesting and promising, which are maybe a little bit exotic, but that might be a way in which this domain can evolve. So I remind you that we started with this quote, so I would like to close with this quote about symmetry from Hermann Weyl. That was really one big idea that you can trace back to ancient times in science, in mathematics, in geometry in particular. And this is symmetry. And we've seen that we can apply this principle on different types of objects, whether it's grids, whether it's homogeneous spaces, graphs, manifolds, meshes, and probably even more general and abstract structures, to derive learning architectures, the inductive biases that serve the foundations to some of the most recognized and widely used architectures, such as GNNs, deep sets, transformers, graph neural networks, different forms of intrinsic and mesh GNNs, and also, well, we didn't talk about it, but also for some recurrent models such as LSTM, you can also derive them from considerations of symmetry. So the question is, what's next? What will be the next chapter in this field? And together with my co-authors, we've been doing, well, already second year in a row, these kind of predictions or a summary of geometric and graph ML in what has been exciting, what are the promising directions, by basically interviewing some of the prominent researchers in this field. So we did it last year, we did it this year as well. And I would like to refer to some quotes and then show how they might be manifesting themselves. So this is a quote from Will Hamilton. So he is mainly known for the graph stage framework, but many other papers on the topic. And he was saying that we've seen, mainly in 2020, the field come to terms with the fundamental limitations of the message passing paradigm. So the fact that, for example, message passing is equivalent to the Weisfeld-Levin graph isomorphism test shows that certain structures cannot be detected. And it requires methods that go beyond these limitations. So several ways we talked about some of them. I think Chris Bodnar as well mentioned some of them. So one of such ideas would be to go beyond propagation of information between nodes along the edges of the graph, and to use more exotic, higher dimensional, higher order structures, such as simplicial or cellular complexes, and define maybe higher dimensional analogies of the Weisfeld-Levin color refinement schemes for these kind of topological objects. And you can show that these schemes are not only more powerful theoretically, but also in some applications they more naturally model the structures that arise in these architectures. And chemistry is probably one example. So it's interesting that graph neural networks, as I've shown in the introduction lecture, can be traced back to the problems in chemoinformatics, and even the Weisfeld-Levin algorithm was inspired by the work of Veličković, who was a chemist and was mainly concerned with the problem of how to organize and retrieve molecules using computational methods. So I'm personally surprised why a chemist would think of a molecule as a graph, because chemists don't think of molecules as collections of atoms and chemical bonds. They think of them as chemical structures or maybe even reactions. And therefore, graphs are not necessarily the best way of representing molecules. They indeed might contain all the information there. But for example, if you cannot, with Weisfeld-Levin tests, you cannot detect even triangles, let alone about cycles. And cycles constitute an important structure in organic molecules, so structures like aromatic rings are extremely important. So we want some way of representing structures that capture this prior knowledge or inductive biases in chemistry. And cellular complexes appear to be such structures. So another interesting direction is explainable GNNs. So I think this is one of the common criticisms for not only for graph neural networks, for deep learning in general, is that they are not explainable. So there are several ways that this explainability can be incorporated. So one of them is modeling physical systems, is to try to learn message passing functions that are physically correct and interpretable. So this is a very nice paper by Cranmer from 2 years ago, where they learned on multi-particle system generic message passing function, and then they regressed symbolic equations that essentially give you a closed form formula for how the different constituents of such a system interact with each other. Another topic is algorithmic reasoning. I think that was mentioned by Petar, where it's an attempt to marry our algorithms with neural networks to take advantages of both worlds in terms of the generalization, interpretability, and generalization across data and across tasks. And another interesting topic is causal inference, where you can try to build a graph that describes the causal relations between different nodes. So this is a very prominent and popular topic nowadays in drug discovery, where you can now, with modern technology, you can do high throughput gene perturbations. So you can take a cell and modify it and see how it reacts, for example, to different drugs. And from this, you can try to build a model of the disease and of the therapy, and understanding how different, for example, malignant cells, what is the change in the biochemistry would allow to design better therapies for these diseases. And then, of course, there is a field of knowledge graphs that I think has historically stood a little bit apart, and many models that emerged in this domain were to represent the structure of knowledge graphs that typically come in triplets, where you have two objects and the relation between them. So methods such as graph embedding, such as trans-E or trans-R, that we didn't discuss in this course, were emerged from this domain. Now, here's another quote. So this is Thomas Kipf, that you probably know from the GCN architecture, that mentioned this particularly noteworthy trend in GraphML is the separation of computational and data structure. So the graph in graph neural networks, at least traditionally, has been the same input graph used for the propagation of information. And we've seen that in many cases, this is not necessarily friendly. You can get phenomena such as bottlenecks and oversquashing when the graph itself is not appropriate for for message passing. So it might have some bottlenecks that make this flow of information complicated. So there are several works that try to deal with it with graph rewiring. So the famous paper Deagle from the group of Stefan Günnemann in Munich. We also had a paper at ICLEAR earlier this year that was even awarded the best paper honorable mention, where we showed that Ricci curvature could be used to understand these bottlenecks, and rewiring that resembles a Ricci flow, a process from differential geometry, could alleviate these bottlenecks and make information flow more efficient in graphs. So there is also interesting topic in more traditional network science, so what is called network geometry, trying to think of graphs as discretizations of continuous objects, in particular of hyperbolic spaces, and then along these lines, the derivation of graph neural networks as a discretization of physical processes described by differential equations. So Francesco Di Giovanni talked about it, and I will talk about it today as well. So he was talking about how to derive the graph convolutional framework from gradient flow of Dirichlet type energies, and then basically giving back the credit to this architecture that somehow the folklore in the field believes that it's not powerful enough, especially for dealing with heterophilic graphs. So what he showed is that this is not true. So you need to do channel mixing appropriately in order to make it able to deal with situations of heterophily. Then an interesting topic that in many situations, the graph is actually not a static object. So if you think of a social network or maybe different types of biological graphs, they evolve over time. So dynamic graphs and neural networks to work on this kind of data are also a relatively new and emerging field of study. And another topic is generative models. So generative models have been popularized probably with with GANs, with adversarial neural networks, and more recently with diffusion models. So now we have some amazing results, such as DALI 2 models that can generate images that look very realistic and can also respond to different textual prompt. So something similar for graphs, in particular in the domain of chemistry for synthesis of molecules, is still to be done. So it's an open question. One of the difficulties there that again, the domain itself is what you're generating, and you don't have canonical ordering. So you need to some probably different procedures to do it. So in molecules, for example, one of the structures that was done is to represent molecules as junction trees, and then have some kind of vocabulary of these smaller structures. Then an interesting topic is standardized evaluation. So this gave a big boost to machine learning, and in particular in computer vision with the ImageNet. So this is what typically cited as the turning point for the field in 2012, when convolutional neural networks smashed the ImageNet benchmark by a significant margin. This is also what happened in protein folding, when AlphaFold was a newcomer that outperformed other models that were based on probably decades of insights and intuition and know-how. So in graph neural networks now, there is Open Graph Benchmark that appeared about 2 years ago, and it's already a standard evaluation tool that is used by researchers worldwide. And then, of course, industrial applications. So graph neural networks are now broadly used across the spectrum in many different applications. So one of them, for example, was to design new chips. As you know, it's a combinatorial problem, can be formulated as reinforcement learning with the help of graph neural networks. And then another topic that I should say probably is overlooked in the field is the compatibility of algorithms with hardware. So when you implement a graph neural network, so it's very easy, and maybe a little bit laziness here, to say that let's throw it on a GPU, and then, well, GPU is powerful enough, right? It has sufficient memory to feed the graph, and to basically we can work on it. The problem, of course, is that in applications where the graphs are very large, you cannot do it anymore. So you need to design algorithms that are aware of the hardware. And there are some newcomers that compete with NVIDIA, such as GraphCore, with their IPU architecture that is probably more suitable for certain types of graph learning. So it's an interesting interaction between hardware and software. And then, of course, applications ranging anywhere from self-driving cars to protein design, to drug discovery, to particle physics. So let me talk briefly about these. So I will start maybe with social networks. I work at Petar as my second job. So in social networks, graph neural networks have been used primarily for recommender systems. So I think one of the pioneers was Pinterest with the PinSage. So that was an architecture that productionized the Sage type of graph neural network architecture. Then, for example, recent works from Uber using graph neural networks for food recommendations. And in recommender systems, typically what you try to do is to do age predictions. So you have nodes of the graph, for example, a bipartite graph that can represent users and items that they buy or they like. And based on the edges that exist in this graph, you can try to predict the probability of an edge between a pair of such nodes. And this is how most of these architectures work. So this figure is actually from a paper on AliGraph, which is a recommender system or a framework that powers multiple recommender systems at Alibaba. So I myself, with my students, we've created a company that was acquired by Twitter, and we're using graph neural networks to try to classify misinformation, or so-called fake news, from the way that they propagate on the social network. And we are now part of Twitter, and we work on different applications of graph learning inside Twitter. So this is the team as it was acquired 3 years ago. Now in 3D vision and graphics, so if you look at ways of representing geometric data, so obviously there are multiple ways of thinking of three-dimensional objects. You can think of them, for example, as volumes and rasterize them using voxels, or you can think of them as point clouds, or you can think of them as discrete manifolds or meshes. So this is, for example, typical input signal from a LiDAR. So it's a specially structured point cloud. This is what the sensor on a self-driving car sees, and you can use this information, for example, to predict where the cars nearby will be moving, right? So some kind of predictive capability that, for example, will allow the self-driving car to try to avoid accidents and situations that might be dangerous to the driver. So I think I showed this video as well in my lecture about manifolds. So this is an example of motion capture. So here the face of the actor is scanned in real time by a 3D sensor. This was actually a sensor that I've been developing at Intel. That was another startup that we sold 10 years ago. That became what was known as the RealSense technology. And here the problem is that the motion of the input pose of the actor's face is synthesized in this Shrek-like looking avatar. So it's a problem of correspondence and synthesis. So you both find correspondence between the noisy input and some canonical face, and then you deform it to repeat the input structure. We've been also working on similar applications where the input is actually a two-dimensional image or a video. So the encoder is standard convolutional neural network, and the decoder is a mesh CNN. And in particular, my student Dominique Coulon worked on hand pose and shape reconstruction. This is a difficult problem because hand has a lot of occlusions and ambiguities. And in collaboration with the British startup Ariel AI, we showed this application at CVPR 2 years ago, where we had real-time avatars running on an iPhone with detailed hands that were reconstructed this way. And Ariel was acquired also almost 2 years ago by Snap. So now this is part of Snap technology that incorporates these methods. Now I mentioned applications in physics. So this is a quote from Kyle Cranmer. So he's a professor at NYU. I think actually he recently moved from NYU, and he was one of the discoverers of the Higgs boson at LHC. And he was very keen on using graph neural networks for different applications in particle physics. And this is LHC, so this is actually one of the detectors in the Atlas experiment that was used to detect the Higgs boson. And the way that graph neural networks are used there is that you can describe interactions of different particles as this kind of particle jet. So particles are created and disappear and produce new particles when they interact. So this can be described as a graph, and then you can use graph neural networks, for example, both to reconstruct these jets from the observations in the detector, as well as classify some events. So I myself, with Joan, we had a collaboration with the team of IceCube, which is a neutrino observatory in the South Pole. It's a cubic kilometer of detectors. And why you need such a big detector? Because neutrinos, as you probably know from courses in physics, they don't interact with matter. So they very rarely interact with matter. And in order to pick up these interactions, you need a very large detector. So this detector is actually a very large array of photomultipliers that see light, what is called Cherenkov radiation, when neutrinos interact with the matter in this ice. And because ice is transparent, you can see this glow. It is picked up by the photodetectors, and this is an example of a signal that the different energy, different time that is deposited on the detectors. And looking at the signal, you can try to classify whether this neutrino comes from an astrophysical source somewhere deep and far in the universe, or is it some background, for example, coming from our nearby sun. So this actually has been used. The neutrino observatory was used for first multi-messenger astronomy, what is called. So you can detect a source of neutrino and then point a standard telescope and see actually where it comes from, for example, some supernova explosion. Then other interesting applications. So I think this was from DeepMind, fluid simulation, where different multi-particle systems were modeled as graph neural networks, where the edges represent different types of interactions. And instead of solving a complicated differential equation that governs this flow of fluids, or that is notoriously complicated, equations such as Navier-Stokes, these can be compressed in a sense by graph neural networks. So in biology and in drug discovery, graph neural networks, right, and more generally geometric deep learning techniques have been used also quite extensively. So many of the problems, again, as I mentioned, come from chemistry, and here in particular we're talking about biochemistry, and in particular we're talking about proteins. So as you probably know, proteins are chemical molecules that are encoded in our DNA. So our life that we know on Earth, we don't know any other life forms that is not based on proteins. So proteins are encoded in our DNA. So proteins are composed of different amino acids. So 20 what is called proteinogenic amino acids. Each triplet of nucleotides in our DNA encodes one amino acid that is then inside the cell using special chemical machinery becomes a protein. So cells essentially are built to produce proteins that make them work. And basically, it's a very long chain of these simple building blocks, amino acids, that under the influence of electrostatic forces folds into complicated structures such as sheets or helices. And you can think of this analogy, this snake toy that is one-dimensional structure, but you can fold it into many different shapes. And the problem of protein folding, basically predicting how the structure will look like given a sequence, has been a classical problem in structural biology already from the 70s. So Christian Anfinsen in the 70s conjectured that the folding structure of the protein can be fully determined by the amino acid sequence. And there was a kind of image that was called CASP in structural biology domain that people were competing, trying to predict the structure from sequence. And in 2018, AlphaFold from DeepMind significantly outperformed the competing approaches. So that was a kind of ImageNet moment in structural biology. And then 2 years ago, AlphaFold 2 performed even better. And AlphaFold 2, as we'll hear in the last lecture by one of the authors, is actually a geometric architecture, and it uses a component that is called invariant point attention, which is what we called equivariant graph neural networks or equivariant message passing. And proteins are really ubiquitous. So more or less any biological system you pick up, whether it's transferring oxygen to our cells or defense against pathogens, right? Antibodies are proteins. So a lot of these mechanisms are powered by proteins. So any chemical reaction that happens in the body is catalyzed by enzymes, which are proteins. Even our skin has its elastic structure thanks to a special protein that is called collagen. And when we get older, we lose it. So that's why we have wrinkles on our face. And proteins, because they are so ubiquitous and they appear more or less in every biochemical system, they are standard targets for drugs. So typically the way that it looks, you have a protein that is responsible for something, and it has these kind of pocket-like structures. And the development of drugs tries to find a small molecule that will fit into this pocket and will inhibit the interaction of the protein. So it will block the protein from interacting with some other proteins, and as a result, certain system will be activated or disrupted. So most of the drugs are actually inhibitors of protein receptors. And what is shown here is actually it's not a drug. Well, it's a drug-like substance. It's a caffeine, or more correctly, one of the substances from the same class that is called xanthines. And this is what happens when you drink your coffee in the morning. So this molecule gets into your bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and binds to an adenosine receptor in the brain. And this is what makes you awake and happy and so on. But many targets are actually that are now interesting for the biopharmaceutical industry. They don't have this kind of pocket-like structure. Probably one good example is what is called the program death complex. So these are two proteins that interact with each other, and their interface is flat, so they don't have any pockets. And these kind of targets are considered hard to drug or even undruggable by traditional small molecules because there is nowhere to fit this small molecule there. And the analogy here that you want to think of is a kind of a lock and the key metaphor. So we have complementary geometric structures. So not only geometric, they're also charged surfaces. And in this particular example of PD1 and PDL1, the program death complex, it appeared to have an extremely important role in cancer therapy because basically what is responsible for is to disabling the immune system from killing our own healthy tissue. And this is what some types of cancer produce. And this protein prevents the malignant cells to be destroyed by the normal action of T cells in the immune system. So the idea of immunotherapy, or better called checkpoint immunotherapy, is to block one of these proteins, PD-1, PD-L1, and it then allows the immune system to take control back and destroy the tumor. So this was a very important discovery that was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2018. Now, in order to design this kind of these drugs, right? So this is a drug of a new type that is called a biological drug or a biologic. You need to solve, in a sense, an inverse folding problem. So instead of going from amino acid sequence to structure, you want to find out what is the amino acid sequence, right? What is the protein that will fold in a certain way, that will have certain geometric structure that will give it certain functional properties. So probably at a conceptual level, you can say that we go from sequence to structure to function. And unfortunately, this is not as straightforward. Sequences are obviously very easy to analyze, and some early works in bioinformatics tried to look at sequences and compare them as essentially strings or substrings. Now, you can find proteins that have very similar sequences and different structures. So it might be some unhappy mutation just in one amino acid that results in completely different folding, or vice versa. You can find similar structures that come from different sequences. So different sequences will fold in the same way. And then you can also find proteins with very different structures that, for example, bind some molecules. So they have the same function, but they come from very different structures. And this is also happening in what is called convergent evolution. So when different organisms evolve separately, but you need a protein that fulfills the same function. So you get to it from, so to say, different directions evolutionarily. So what I did with my collaborators in Switzerland, so we designed geometric architectures. So that was, in this case, we represented proteins as surfaces, and we tried to predict where and how they will be binding. And this was an important step in designing new proteins, what is called de novo or from scratch design, where the protein with desired properties, for example, binding to the oncological PD-L1 target is built in this way. And that was an architecture that we called Massif. We had also several follow-up works, including some new designed binders for both for oncological targets as well as for the, for example, coronavirus spike protein. So it's data-driven architecture that significantly accelerates and makes principled rational design of proteins significantly easier task. So hopefully at some point it will be used in the development of new therapeutic compounds. So I mentioned, well, obviously drug design. So in general, the problem of drug design is that it takes quite some time to deliver a drug to the market. So typically 10 years, about $2 billion investment. And the reason is that drugs are discarded at different stages of testing. So they're subjected to a very rigorous testing process, clinical trials. And one of the issues is that the space of search for different molecules that could be used as potential drug is extremely large. So something like 10 to the power 60. So it's combinatorial complexity. Whereas something that you can test in the lab, well, maybe now with high throughput chemistry, you can test tens, if not hundreds of thousands of molecules, but still the gap is huge. So this gap is typically breached computationally, and that's why you can use different models, such as, for example, molecular dynamics. So you can try to solve quantum mechanical systems to understand, for example, how proteins fold and how they interact with other proteins or with small molecules. You can use maybe some approximations, such as density functional theory. So graph neural networks have actually been reintroduced to chemistry from where they originated, in particular the work of Justin Gilmer from 2017, exactly as a way of make more efficient these kind of predictions. So predicting chemical properties of molecules such as solubility, toxicity, and so on. So all the different properties that you need to know in order to choose your suitable candidates for a drug. And graph neural networks have made some splash, not only in the machine learning community, but also outside of it, even in the popular press, with this publication of a paper in Cell, which is one of the major journals in biology, where the group at MIT used graph neural networks as part of a pipeline to discover new antibiotic compounds. In particular, they showed that the drug that was tested for against diabetes had very powerful antibiotic properties and could be applied also to antibiotic resistant organisms. So as you probably know, we already have a lot of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics that now available. And I think the estimate is that more than 1 million people each year die from these diseases. So it's just a matter of time when we have a pandemic on the global scale that will be caused by these antibiotic resistant pathogens. So we need very urgently a new class of antibiotics. And this is probably one way of discovering them. Then another way of using new drugs. So instead of developing a new molecule that takes a lot of time and a lot of money to develop, we can actually take approved molecules that are known to be safe and use them in combination. And some combinations actually have non-linear synergistic effect. Some others have antagonistic or maybe side effects. And this was one of the first uses of graph neural networks by Marinka Zitnik, who is now a professor at Harvard Medical School. So she used graph neural networks to predict interactions of combinations of drugs. So this is also standard way of administering treatments, what is called polypharmacy, or combinatorial therapy, where we use multiple drugs at the same time. And the way that she considered it is by looking at protein-to-protein interaction networks. So that's a graph that represents roughly how the biology of the body works. So the proteins there represent drug targets. So this is modeled by drug-to-protein interaction graph. And then she tried to predict edges in the drug-to-drug interaction graph, where you knew the nodes but not the edges. So the system was called Decagon, and it has been one of, as I said, one of the early successes of these kind of techniques. With my collaborators at Imperial College, we tried to take these ideas to the domain of food, and you probably know that food is full with compounds that belong to the same chemical classes as some therapeutic drugs. And it's not surprising, so many drugs that actually exist nowadays, especially drugs against cancer, they have natural analogs in the plant kingdom. So if you take, for example, a drug like camptothecin, so it's a compound that is found in the bark of a tree that grows in China, and 4 of its synthetic analogs are used against cancer as chemotherapeutic agents. And there are many other examples. So probably if you take even a very common drug like aspirin, so aspirin, the chemical name is acetyl salicylic acid, and salicyl comes from the name of the willow tree in Latin salice. So it has been known from antiquity for its analgesic properties. So bottom line, we have a lot of stuff that comes with our food that we have no clue what it does. So it's kind of dark matter of nutrition. So it's not tracked by regulators, right? So if you buy packaged food, you will see probably content of proteins and fats and carbohydrates and vitamins and minerals, but not something like flavonoids or indoles and so on. So we want to understand basically how these things work. And to do this, we tried to look at the way that compounds interact with protein targets. And if we have some examples of drugs, for example, that work against cancer, so we can take FDA-approved anti-cancer drugs, and we can train a classifier that predicts anti-cancer drug likeness from the way that the compound interacts with target proteins. And then we can apply it to compounds that are found in food. And doing this, we can construct a map of different foods and the way that the kind of compounds that they contain and share. And well, obviously, it is slightly more complicated than I'm describing. So we also had to look at different mechanisms that would be convincing to biologists and medics that it really does what is expected. So in this way, we had to mine automatically medical literature in the cancer community. So, for example, looking for effects such as anti-proliferation or anti-angiogenesis, so the growth of blood vessels that is typically associated with cancer. And using this, we were able to detect these compounds in food that have potentially anti-cancer drug-like properties. So what was cool in this project was collaboration with chef Bruno Barbieri. So he's a very famous Italian chef and the judge of MasterChef Italy, the TV show, and he used the compounds that we identified to present recipes that in this case contained compounds that have potential antiviral properties. So in the remaining time, let me say a few words about some future directions. So this was actually will be more or less the same talk that I gave here in Padova in WCCI, conference on computational intelligence. And if we take a step back and look at graph neural networks, right, as we discussed them, so there is a little bit of kind of asymmetry or injustice in the sense that we typically assume that the data is contained in the nodes, and then the edges of the graph are used to propagate this information, right, in the form of message passing. And basically, the structure of the graph is somehow captured by the way that we send information on it. So as we know from the Weisfeld-Lehmann test, right, that is equivalent to message passing, that we can discover certain graph structures by basically by sending information to our neighbors. So I think it's maybe slightly exaggerating. We can say that the nodes are data and the edges are computation. And we see two problems in this, right? So the problem that we use the same graph as a data and a computational object. One of them is that some structures cannot be detected by message passing, right? So here you can see an example that would be deemed equivalent by the Weisfeld-Lehmann algorithm. So in this case, we can attach some additional information to the nodes and the edges, for example, by looking at some substructures, like counting, for example, the number of triangles or cycles in the graph. And this is what is typically known as positional structural encoding. Another problem is that some graphs might be very unfriendly for passing information. So think of this graph where you have a bottleneck, and you need to squeeze all the information into this pair of nodes that connect these two communities. So the standard remedy in the literature is graph rewiring, where you allow to change the graph in a way that will facilitate the propagation of information. Now, another thing is that if you look at the broader perspective of geometric deep learning, then we have different structures such as grids or meshes and then graphs, and graphs really stand apart in the following sense: that you can think of a grid as a discretization of the plane, for example. You can think of a mesh as a discretization of a manifold. So they all have some kind of underlying continuous objects. But what is the continuous analogy of graph? So this is something that is not very clear. And if we compare the kind of structures, right, in these objects and the amount of ambiguity, so grids are probably the most structured objects. We don't have any ambiguity. If I look at the neighbors of a node in a grid, then we have a very well prescribed canonical ordering. So I can say that I have a neighbor at the top, a neighbor at the bottom, at the right, at the left. So there is no ambiguity whatsoever. In a mesh, we have slightly more ambiguity. And the ambiguity here is that I can still choose arbitrarily the first node, right? But once I choose it, then I can order all the rest of the nodes, for example, in clockwise orientation. So remember that we talked about gauge ambiguity, so the choice of the local system of coordinates. So exactly here we have this rotation or cyclic shift ambiguity when we talk about meshes. In graphs, on the other hand, we have very general permutation. So graphs out of these structures, they have the least structure, right? So they have the most ambiguity. And what we are trying to say is that we can take inspiration for designing graph neural networks from physical systems. So we can use a physical system as a metaphor for learning. And this is a figure from a cool paper that appeared in Nature earlier this year, where they incorporated real-life physical systems, such as electronic circuit or an optical setup, into deep learning pipelines, even backpropagate through the system. So this is not what we are trying to say. So we want to use metaphorically a physical system as a model for learning. And again, this is probably not a very new idea. So you can think of a system that is parameterized maybe by a small number of parameters, and then you try to reach a certain state by some trajectory in this control in this parameter space. And this is what
this is Michael.
Yeah. Question?
Yeah, there's a question.
Yep.
Yes. So what makes graph unsuitable for message passing?
So what makes graphs unsuitable for message passing? So some graphs are not, I wouldn't say unsuitable, they are not very friendly. So, well, I have a slide about it, but let me anticipate. So what happens is the following situation then. When you have the structure of the graph is such that it has many neighbors, right? So technically speaking, this is what we call volume growth. So when the volume growth is exponential, this happens, for example, in social networks, in small world graphs, where if you look at the neighbors of the neighbors of the neighbors, then the number explodes exponentially. So we have too many neighbors with their features. And if my problem depends on information from nodes that are several hops away, I get into a situation when I need to squeeze a lot of information into a single feature vector. And this is called oversquashing. So in this case, the graph is not friendly for message passing. So it's difficult to propagate information on such a graph. Well, I will get to a more formal description of this situation. So bear with me for a few minutes. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, there is another question.
Yes, there's another question.
Yeah. Applying genetic learning to the recommendation system, is it possible to make a recommendation system based on the similarity of content and users at the same time? Well, so this is more or less what you try, right? So this will probably be described by some features that you have associated with users and with the content. So one of the issues with using graph neural networks for recommender systems is that is structural ambiguity. So what I mean by this is the following. So if you have nodes in the graph, right? So if I have a pair of nodes and some structure around it, and I have an edge, and I'm trying to predict whether this edge should be here or not. If I have another part of the graph which structurally looks the same, then when I'm using a graph neural network to embed the nodes, so usually these kind of recommender systems, they represent the graph in some vector space, so every node corresponds to a vector. And then these different structures, even though they're completely unrelated and they're located in different parts of the graph, will be indistinguishable. So they have the same vector representation. And as a result, I will be predicting edges where they shouldn't be edges. So that's why the way that graph neural networks are used to predict edges in graphs is actually as an edge classification problem, so or a subgraph classification. So you look at the graph that surrounds an edge, and you try to classify it, right? So you say if it's one, then there is an edge between the two nodes in this graph, and if it's zero, then there is no edge. So this ambiguity actually makes graph neural networks work problematically for edge prediction. Okay. So let's continue. So basically, we are looking for physical metaphors for physical systems that, when discretized, will give rise to graph neural networks. And probably the most obvious thing that can come to your mind when you deal with propagation of information, this is diffusion equations, right? So I hope that you've seen diffusion equations in this or another form in some basic calculus or differential equations courses. So what is a diffusion equation? Essentially, you have some quantity, let's say temperature, on some domain, right, on some medium. So let's say in the plane, the different colors represent different values of temperature. Now, the difference or the gradient in the temperature at different points create what is called the heat flux. So there is a flow of temperature from hot to cold, right? And also temperature, unless you have sources of heat, is not created out of nowhere and doesn't disappear anywhere. So there is some conservation condition. And this conservation condition tells you that the only reason why temperature changes in time infinitesimally is because there is this heat flux. Okay, so put together, this gives you a diffusion equation. So the left-hand side tells you that the instantaneous change in the temperature, x here denotes temperature at point u and at time t. And the right-hand side is roughly tells you how much heat flux goes through a point, and it's also scaled by what's called the diffusivity constant. So the diffusivity constant can be a function in general, can depend on position and orientation. In the simplest case, it's constant everywhere, so then you can take it out of the divergence, and as you know, divergence of the gradient is the Laplacian operator. So we call these kind of diffusion equations homogeneous and isotropic. And you can interpret it as a gradient flow of the Dirichlet energy. So if you remember Francesco's lecture, so that's exactly what it is. So the Dirichlet energy measures how smooth your signal is. And basically, the diffusion equation produces a gradient flow that tries to reduce this energy to zero. And in the Euclidean case, you can also write it as in closed form as conversion with a Gaussian filter. So essentially, it's a low-pass filtering process. And there are obviously more interesting versions of the diffusion equation. So you can make the diffusivity position dependent. So in this case, we call the diffusion non-homogeneous. Or you can also make it not only position, but also direction dependent. And in this case, it's called anisotropic. So isotropic means same in every direction. And these kind of equations attracted a lot of attention about 30 years ago, starting from the seminal work of Pietro Perrone and Jitendra Malik. And what they said is the following thing. So there is this one-to-one correspondence between low-pass filtering and diffusion equation. So if you take an image, Isaac Newton in this case, and you apply to it a diffusion equation, you get low-pass filter, right? So an image in the middle. And this way you can remove noise from the image, right? You will average it out. But of course, this is not an image that you want to see, because by doing this kind of diffusion, you also destroyed sharp discontinuities that are very important for visual perception. So the discontinuity is what is called edges in the image. So what they propose is to say, let's make a diffusion adaptive. So the diffusion will be controlled by some function that is inversely proportional to the norm of the gradient. So it's an edge indicator. In other words, when the diffusion sees that the pixels are different from the pixel at which the diffusion kernel is positioned, then we'll slow down or stop the diffusion. So the diffusion, in other words, will not be mixing pixels of different color. And this is what happens when you do this process. So this nonlinear diffusion on the right, you see that it removes noise from continuous regions, but it preserves the important discontinuities. And this has really opened an entire field of variational and PDE-based image processing. And it was mathematically, admittedly, very aesthetic and very pleasant concept. So you start with a functional that tells you basically how your image should look like, right? So functional is a kind of function of functions, right? That gives a number, assigns a number to a function. Images in this case are modeled as functions. And then you can derive optimality conditions. So these are called Euler-Lagrange equations. So it's a partial differential equation that gives you a gradient flow, so a kind of minimization process for this functional. So you start with an image, you evolve it with a PDE, and then it flows to the minimum of this functional, like the Dirichlet energy and the diffusion equation. Now, why I think it would be fair to say why these methods have almost disappeared in the past years after the emergence of deep learning, exactly for the same reason why all the handcrafted descriptors in computer vision have disappeared. And this is because it's very difficult to design something a priori that will work for any kind of data and for any kind of task. And that's where deep learning actually was the monumental difference. And what we are trying to do in our work is to reinterpret these methods, adapt them to the deep learning context, and apply them to graphs. So what's the difference between closed form solution of the heat diffusion and random walks? Well, random walks, you can interpret them as some form of diffusion. So there are some nuances. So usually these are not symmetric, but otherwise, yeah, you can think of random walks as a kind of discrete diffusion process. Yeah, so that's a very good question. And then basically, we can formulate a diffusion equation on the graph. So in this case, remember that we have basically these three ingredients. So we have the gradient. So the gradient in this case will be just the difference between the features at endpoints of an edge. Then we have the diffusivity function. So it's some nonlinear function that depends on the that weights every edge by some scalar number that depends on the features at the two endpoints. And then we have the divergence that essentially sums all the edges that emanate from a node. Now, pay attention that the time here is continuous. So we have a differential equation that is nonlinear and needs to be solved numerically. So now I should say that the difference in terminology between PDEs and ODEs, so this is actually, technically speaking, a system of coupled ordinary differential equation for each node. So ODE or PDE, the only difference is that in PDEs you have also discretization of the spatial domain, not only the time. And well, we'll get to it in a second. So graph is inherently discrete object. So we want also to discretize the graph, to think of it as discretization of a continuous object. Okay, but here we already get the space discretized. We need to discretize time. And the simplest way is just to take fixed steps of fixed size. And this is what is called explicit or forward Euler scheme, where you take just forward differences in time, and this is what you get. So you get evolution equation of this form. So if I rearrange the terms a little bit, what surprisingly you find that you can interpret graph attention networks that we've seen with Petar as a particular discretization of this graph diffusion equation. So what we call attention is actually a diffusivity function that is normalized in a special way. Okay, and no nonlinearity in this case, and a unit step size. But of course, we don't need to use only an explicit scheme. So there is a zillion of different numerical schemes to discretize differential equations. So we can use implicit schemes. We can use semi-implicit multi-step schemes such as Runge-Kutta. So the numerical analysis has probably more than 150 years of experience on these different discretizations. And the way that it works, let's say that you're trying to solve a node classification problem. So you will start with some initial features, maybe after some encoding. Then you will diffuse them by parametric diffusion equation where the diffusivity function is parameterized. And then you will read out the resulting node features, maybe with some decoder that is denoted here by psi. And basically, in this case, A, the diffusivity function is learnable. If we make it independent of time, it means that I will have shared weights across layers. So now the analogy of layers will be the steps of the iterative solver. And we don't have the traditional notion of depth. We have now the diffusion time. And I can discretize it differently. I can use, for example, adaptive steps. So I can have bigger steps where necessary and smaller steps where it's required. And one of the reasons why you should be doing it is, for example, in traditional graph neural networks, it's difficult to make them deep. One of the reasons is that you get phenomena such as oversmoothing. So in this way, you can overcome this phenomenon. So the question is, what is X refers to edges and what is K and R? So in this case, K is the number of layers. T capital is the diffusion time. Tau is the step size. I didn't see the R. This is probably what you meant by tau, right? Yeah, tau is the step size. So if you make constant steps in time. Now, you can think of it, maybe you can ask, okay, why are we doing it? So this just looks like a formal exercise, and basically you get the same stuff just from different considerations. I think it gives a new perspective on classical, well-known problems in graph neural networks, such as oversmoothing and bottlenecks. But also, not only that you can interpret existing architectures such as GATT as discretization of diffusion equation, which is of course nice, but also some solvers such as multi-grid solvers or multi-step solvers, they don't have immediate analogies or immediate instances in the graph learning literature. And it means that maybe there will be future architectures that will be exploiting these kind of solvers. And then, of course, basically by interpreting graph neural networks as discretized differential equations, you can also leverage huge literature from these domains, such as stability and convergence guarantees that are very important to understanding and analyzing the properties of graph neural networks. And furthermore, well, I will show it later in the last slides, it also offers links to other maybe more exotic fields, such as differential geometry and algebraic topology, that is far less known in the GNN literature and I would say in machine learning in general. So let me take you back again to where we started, right? So we started with diffusion, and the analogy was diffusion on images, right, or on grids. So on grids, when you discretize your diffusion equation, you have many ways of doing it. So in particular, let's say that you take isotropic homogeneous diffusion that involves the Laplacian operator. These are three different ways I can discretize the Laplacian, right? So I can take, for example, the typically 4 neighbors, or I can rotate everything by 45 degrees and take other 4 neighbors, or I can take more distant neighbors. Or because the operators are linear, any convex combination of these discretizations is also a valid discretization of the Laplacian. So you see that on a grid, basically the way, the graph that you build to discretize your operators is completely arbitrary. Right, so it's mainly determined by numerical convenience. So I can change it the way I want. I can even discretize my domain different at every point. So what I'm trying to say is that we want to think of our graphs in graph neural networks in a similar way. So we want to say that I'm allowed to change the graph, and the graph will be changed based on whatever is more convenient for the problem I'm trying to solve. And here again, I will appeal to previous works that have been done in the computer vision and image processing community. And we've seen this nonlinear diffusion of Perona and Malik. another model that was developed also in the 90s, actually by my PhD advisor, Ron Kimmel, was non-Euclidean diffusion. So in this case, we consider the image as a manifold that is embedded in a joint space that contains positional coordinates and feature coordinates. So in case of an image, the positional coordinates will be just the XY coordinates of the pixel, and the feature coordinates will be, for example, the colors, R, G, and B colors. So with this model, the image is considered as a two-dimensional manifold or a surface in R5, right? So we have the XY and then R, G, and B. And it's a manifold that is embedded or geometrically realized in this high-dimensional space. So basically, we are talking about Riemannian manifolds. So there is a canonical way that we can define a Riemannian metric on this manifold by the pullback mechanism. Remember, we talked about it when we discussed manifolds. So I have a particular Riemannian metric with respect to which I can write derivatives, such as the Laplacian. This is called the Laplace-Beltrami operator. And the diffusion equation on this manifold is actually a gradient flow of a generalization of the Dirichlet energy that is called the Polyakov functional. So it's an energy that is used in high energy physics in string theory. So basically, how does it apply to graphs? So on a graph, we can say that now every node comes with two types of coordinates. I have the standard feature coordinates that I denote by X, but I also have positional coordinates that I denote by U. So we embed the graph in some space. It doesn't need to be an exact representation from which I can reproduce the graph. What I'm using it for is to make some kind of continuous graph rewiring. And what I mean by this is that I'm evolving by my diffusion equation both coordinates, U and V, right, as written here. So the diffusion equation with learnable diffusivity operates on the joint coordinates, Z and Z, right, U and X. Then the evolution of the X component, the feature components, is the standard feature diffusion. But the evolution of U, the positional component, it can bring some nodes closer or further away from each other. And if I see that two nodes come close together, then I can say, okay, I will create an edge here, right? Or if they drift apart, I can say I can cut this edge because these nodes should not interact anymore. So this is a kind of graph rewiring that is done continuously on the fly. And probably the best way to visualize it with this animation. So this is the Cora graph, which is a small citation network. So the colors here represent different features, a low-dimensional projection. The positions of the circles represent a two-dimensional positional encoding. And the task here is node classification. So we want to obtain clear clusters. And you see that the clusters are obtained both in the features and in the positions of the nodes. And you see also that the graph changes as the evolution happens. So some of the edges, when the nodes become far away, are cut. Okay, so that's how this graph Beltrami flow works. Now, you may find it a little bit disturbing or maybe even bizarre to see, at least for traditional image processing. So you do filtering or some process on a domain that is changing under your feet, right? So the domain is evolving together with the data on the domain. But this is actually a very common viewpoint in differential geometry, and it's very common in differential geometry to take a manifold and evolve it by some differential equation, and in particular, you evolve the metric of manifold, of Riemannian manifold. And the most famous way of doing it, such evolution equation, is called the Ricci flow, where you evolve the Riemannian metric according to the Ricci curvature tensor. So this is an equation that is shown here. G is, if you remember from the lecture manifolds, is the Riemannian metric tensor. On the right-hand side, you have the Ricci curvature tensor. So structure, it looks very much like the diffusion equation. You have the temporal derivative of something. And on the right-hand side, you have a second-order quantity, the Ricci curvature that is a little bit similar to the Laplacian. Now, of course, it's only structural similarity because the property of this equation is very different. I think there was a question. How to express graph positional coordinates in a way that preserves the invariance? It's a good question. So I don't have an immediate answer to this. Usually what you will be doing here, so these kind of applications assume that you're working on a given graph. So you don't want to generalize across different graphs. Yeah, it's a very good question. So positional encoding has been used in many different ways. So for example, you can use Laplacian eigenfunctions for positional encoding. I think Hagai Maron had a paper that looked into it deeper, how to basically combine invariant positional encoding with equivariant message passing. Yeah, but it's a very good one. Anyway, so the Ricci flow works like this, and what it takes, for example, when you apply it to this double-shaped manifold that has negative curvature in the bottleneck and positive curvature in the spheres that comprise it. When you evolve this manifold under Ricci flow, and here I'm showing the backwards flow in time, then this dumbbell become more sphere-like and then will collapse into a point. And why this is important? Because this is how we can characterize high-dimensional spheres. So if you think of a two-dimensional sphere, right, I can take a closed curve on the sphere and collapse it into a point. So anything that topologically looks like a sphere. If I have a torus, for example, so imagine that this is a torus, a curve like this that goes across the donut cannot be collapsed into a point. And a famous result from Poincaré called the Poincaré conjecture suggested that this is how you can characterize high-dimensional spheres. And actually, Ricci flows were introduced by Richard Hamilton exactly with the scope of proving the Poincaré conjecture. He himself didn't manage to provide the full proof. This was done by Grigory Perelman about 15 years ago. And that was the breakthrough of the year, the proof of the Poincaré conjecture, actually a more general result that contains the Poincaré as a particular case. Now, if you ask, what does it have to do with graphs? So somebody asked about why and how graphs can be unfriendly for message passing. So here's an illustration. We have a small world network, and the volume in this graph grows exponentially, right? So the volume, in this case, you can think of it as the sum of the degrees. So roughly speaking, the number of neighbors that I have. So if I go to the neighbors of the neighbors of the neighbors, then their number will grow exponentially. And if I have a task where I need to bring information from distant neighbors, then I have a problem with information flow. So mathematically, we can describe it as a kind of sensitivity. So if I have a multi-layer graph neural network, let's say that the activation functions are Lipschitz continuous, then the output at node I will depend on the input at node S that is distant from it through this Jacobian. So I can write the derivative of the output of the last layer of the neural network to the input at some node. And we show that we can bound it, well, by the Lipschitz constant of the network, but also by something that depends on the graph. So it will be some power of the adjacency matrix. So you see that the structure of the graph, or the bottleneck that might be in a graph, is to blame, but it's not very clear how it comes across, right? So it's somehow hidden inside this power of the adjacency matrix. And we know intuitively that there will be some graphs that are more friendly and other graphs that are less friendly. So a pathological example is a tree, right? So as we go deeper, then this quantity decays exponentially with the depth. And basically, it means that this gradient or this Jacobian will be very small. It means that the output of the neural network is insensitive to the input. It means that we have difficulty to propagate information. On the other hand, if we have a graph that looks like a grid, we know that on grids, this is less of an issue. So somehow we need something more nuanced than this power of the adjacency matrix to be able to distinguish between structures like trees and grids. That's exactly what curvature is used for in differential geometry. So curvature allows us to locally tell what is the structure of the space. So if I take 2 points and I shoot geodesics from them, remember what geodesics are, right? In parallel and at the same velocity, so I can track the geodesics and see whether they will meet, right? And in this case, I'm talking locally about something that looks like a sphere or a positively curved object. I can, then the geodesics can remain parallel, and this means that I'm locally Euclidean, or they can diverge, and in this case, the curvature is negative, and I have something that looks like a hyperboloid. So the same idea can be applied to graphs. So we can take 2 nodes connected by an edge. We can look at the edges that emanate from it. And if they tend to form triangles, it's the analogy of converging geodesics. I'm looking at something that looks like a clique, right? If they tend to form rectangles, then I look at something that looks like a grid. And then if they become further away from each other, right? So I look at tree-like structures. So this is the analogy of positive, zero, and negative curvature. And we can define a curvature. Well, there are multiple constructions of the discrete analogs of Ricci curvature on graphs. So this is our construction that we call balanced form and curvature, that for every edge computes this quantity. It doesn't really matter what it is, but what is important that it reproduces the continuous behavior. So in cliques, edges will have positive curvature. On grids, they will have zero curvature, and on trees, they will have negative curvature. Now, the main result of the paper is the relation between this curvature and the Jacobian in the form that tells you that if you have negatively curved edges in the graph, then you can bound the Jacobian. So it will be sufficiently small. It means that there is insensitivity to the input, it means that there is oversquashing phenomenon that is caused by the negatively curved edges. And once we know this, right, so we have this geometric description, more nuanced description of the graph, then we can try to use something similar to Ricci flow to cut out these negatively curved edges and rewire the graph surgically by removing these bottlenecks. And as a result, we get a new structure that is not very different from the input graph, but is more friendly for message passing. So it removes these kind of bottlenecks. So let me show you just one thing. I know that I'm out of time. One thing that is maybe even more exotic. And I remind you that in differential geometry, manifolds are topological objects, right? So as we said, by this kind of hand waving, that they have the notion of neighborhood, but not the notion of distance or angle, right? So graphs are a discrete version of these topological objects. So in a graph, you do have the notion of neighborhood, right? So you can say who your neighbors are, but you don't have any geometry attached to it, right? So it's completely abstract combinatorial object. Now in differential geometry, remember that we said that in order to basically the manifold itself, you can bend it in any way you want. So if you want to assign to geometry, you can do it through a metric that induces a way of moving vectors on the manifold, parallel transport, right? And we also said that more generally can define connection or parallel transport independently of the metric. So in other words, I can define a mechanism that tell me how to move a vector from one point to another, right? From the tangent space at point U and point V. So you can design something like this on a graph. So you can say that every node has associated vector space, right, and edge as well. And you have linear maps that take a vector from between these spaces. These are called restriction maps, and these objects, or the graph with these vector spaces and the maps between them, is called a cellular sheaf. And it's an object that is studied in algebraic topology. And basically the idea here is that we can invent the sheaf on a graph. So you can give me a graph, I can build a sheaf that is the best for certain tasks. Okay, so we can define some kind of way of transporting vectors between adjacent nodes. We can define an analogy of the Laplacian, right? So the Laplacian now, if you remember what Laplacian did, so it averaged the neighbors and subtracted them from the node itself. So here, when I bring information from my neighbors to my node, I will also transform them by some kind of a matrix, by a linear map, right? So basically the same way as a vector, when it moves from one point to another on the manifold, it, for example, rotates, here I need to transform the data before I can use it. And what we show is that you can always pose a classification problem as a diffusion on a graph with this associated sheaf structure, where you can choose the sheaf in such a way that you can classify your nodes. So there is a kind of oracle sheaf that you can design. And then what we can do, we can say, okay, I have a diffusion equation on this cellular sheaf with some initial conditions. I can look at the limit of this equation, and I can see what kind of classification problems can be solved if I assume certain restrictions on the way that the sheaf is constructed. Basically, a certain class or certain group on these transformations between different nodes and edges. And by doing this, we can make an analogy, or maybe we can replace the Weisfeld lemma, which is a purely combinatorial structure, by continuous diffusion equation. And we can talk about expressive power, for example, by whether we can distinguish certain number of classes in a limit of this differential equation. So the last thing I would like to show, and I will stop here, is remember this metaphor of physical system for learning on graphs. So we don't need to limit ourselves to diffusion equations. We can actually talk about, for example, a classical mechanical system when we have oscillators at every node of the graph, and they are coupled through the edges of the graph through some function that is learnable. And basically, it's a more complex model. It also has a kinetic term, so it has both wave and diffusion behavior. So basically the nodes oscillate and there is also some dissipation. And we can show, for example, that the voids over smoothing, and in experimental results it performs better than other models. So it can be actually thought of as a wrapper around standard convolutional or attention functions. So that was a work that was done by Konstantin Rasch and collaborators from ETH Zurich. And it was presented this week at ICML. So I will stop here. So maybe the last question that I would like to ask, and it's maybe a little bit provocative because, for example, Petar would probably not agree with me, is whether it's still valid to call these kind of architectures message passing, because they are coming from physical systems where we don't necessarily need to communicate between a pair of nodes. So we can have systems where, for example, there might be multiple node interactions, or maybe there will be interactions at different distances. And by having this continuous object from which we derive graph neural networks by discretizing the differential equations that govern the respective physical system, we have a much richer space to draw from and to design these kind of architectures. So I consider this an interesting research direction that seems promising, and also connects the dots into many different domains in physics, in differential equations, also in high performance computing, because when it comes to, for example, dealing with very large graphs, so the question of hardware, how to implement algorithms necessarily must be taken into account. But again, I will stop here and will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.